It wasn't like they called her worthless outright, not at first. They wrapped it in polite sighs and tight smiles at family dinners, the kind that made her ears burn but left no mark if you tried to point it out later. They were the kind of parents who bragged about one child, her older brother, the success story, like he was their personal trophy. A stable office job, a mortgage at 30, wedding photos framed above the fireplace. And then there was her, the experiment they couldn't quite figure out how to frame. She'd always been the dreamer, the one who liked drawing, starting tiny craft businesses, freelancing on weekends, quitting office jobs that sucked the air out of her lungs. She worked hard, harder than they ever saw, but her paychecks were never big enough to be impressive, never consistent enough to make them feel safe. At every family party, someone would ask, "So what are you doing now?" She'd list off her projects, a new freelance design contract, tutoring kids in the neighborhood, selling handmade greeting cards online, and they'd nod, eyes already drifting back to her brother's stories about promotions and stock options. When she lost her last real job, a dull admin gig at a small company where the bosses forgot her name half the time, her father didn't even ask why. He just shook his head across the dinner table and said, "You never stick with anything. That's your problem." Her mother tried to soften it with a tired smile, but the words stuck. They always did. For a few months, she scraped by. She picked up odd jobs, clung to the kindness of old friends who let her crash on their couch when she couldn't bear the tension at home. Every morning, she'd get up early, shower, and go sit at the cafe down the street with her laptop, applying for freelance work, revising her resume, trying to stay invisible until she could show them she wasn't just drifting. She wanted so badly to prove that all her hobbies, the ones they said would never add up to anything, could be her future if they'd just let her breathe. But they didn't see the nights she sat up until 3 a.m. figuring out how to price her designs. Or the way she skipped dinners with friends to save for software she needed. They didn't notice her, really. They only noticed the quiet creak of the stairs when she came home late. The clutter of paper samples and boxes of prints she stacked neatly in her room so they wouldn't get in anyone's way. The mess, her father called it. One night, the fight wasn't even a fight, just an offhand comment that sparked something raw. Her father stood at her door, arms crossed, eyes flicking to the piles of boxes, the spreadsheet open on her laptop. "It's time to grow up. Get a real job, or get out." She laughed, a sharp, breathless sound that surprised even her. "I am working. I'm trying. You just can't see it." He shook his head, lips pressed thin. Trying isn't doing. We're not running a charity. You're an adult, act like it." Her mother watched from the hallway, one hand resting on the banister like it was the only thing holding her up. She didn't speak up for her. She never did when it really mattered. So she packed a bag that night. Not much, a box of her designs, her laptop, the savings she'd scraped together from odd jobs, 20 crumpled dollar bills from a purse she'd forgotten about. She didn't slam the door or say anything cruel. She just stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the family photos on the wall, her brother's graduation, her parents on their wedding day, and wondered if they'd ever tell people what they'd done. If they'd brag about this part, too. She walked out into the cold with everything she owned in the trunk of her old car. They didn't run after her. They didn't call. They just turned off the porch light. Maybe they thought they'd finally be rid of her. But she knew something they didn't, there was more than one way to come home. And someday, when they least expected it, she'd walk back through those same doors, but not as the daughter they pitied. Next time, she'd hold the keys. The first few weeks felt like an endless spin cycle of borrowed time. She slept on couches, sometimes a blow-up mattress wedged between someone's bookshelf and their kitchen table. Old friends offered hugs and polite smiles, but she knew most of them were waiting for her to get it together, or quietly betting she'd run home and beg for forgiveness. She didn't. She couldn't. Pride wasn't always a weakness, sometimes it was the only thing holding your ribs in place. She learned quickly that there's a difference between dreaming of working for yourself and doing it because there's no other option. Her laptop, a dented hand-me-down she'd nursed through 4 years of odd jobs, became her lifeline. She hunted down freelance gigs like a starving dog, design logos for small businesses, ghostwrite social posts for influencers who'd never remember her name, edit college essays for desperate students at midnight. Anything that paid. Anything that kept her moving forward, no matter how slow. During the day, she'd camp out in the corner of a public library or the cheapest cafe she could find that didn't mind her nursing a single cup of coffee for hours. She learned to plug her phone charger into her laptop to save on outlets. Her eyes burned by dusk most days, but she kept going, eyes locked on her spreadsheet, a fragile hope that if she kept saying yes to every gig, she'd have enough for a deposit on her own place before her welcome wore out with every couch she borrowed. Every so often, she'd walk past her parents' street just to see it. The old brick building they rented the shopfront from, the place her dad always joked was good enough for people like us. The same building where they paid just enough rent to keep the grumbling landlord off their backs but never enough to do more than slap on a coat of paint when the plaster cracked. She'd stand across the street some nights, half hidden in the shadow of a lamppost, wondering if they'd ever think about her. If they'd feel even a flicker of guilt for telling her to leave with nothing but her notebook and a box of half-finished prints. The answer always came back the same, probably not. She'd heard from her brother, once or twice, short texts that felt more like gloating than concern. Mom says you're being stubborn. Dad says you'll come crawling back soon. Just swallow your pride. She'd read them, finger hovering over the reply button, then toss her phone onto her bag like it was buzzing with static she didn't want in her blood. Some nights, when sleep wouldn't come, she'd open her notebook and run the numbers. Rent for a tiny studio apartment. Internet. A new laptop someday when this one finally gave up. Maybe a small emergency fund, so she'd never again have to knock on doors that slammed in her face. It seemed impossible, but then so had surviving one night on someone else's couch when she first packed her bags. And here she was. Still here. One evening, at a cafe that smelled like burnt coffee and stale bread, she sat next to an old man who watched her peck at her keyboard like her fingers were on fire. He owned a small print shop a few blocks away. He'd seen her designs online, he said, through a mutual friend. You've got talent, kid, he told her. But talent's nothing without stamina. You've got that too, don't you? She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She just nodded, shut her laptop for the first time that day, and promised herself she'd prove him right. Every dollar she made, every project she finished, would be one more brick in the foundation she'd lay for herself, far away from their pity. Far away from their door. They'd kicked her out because they thought she'd never make anything of herself. But she knew now, starting from nothing is just a different way of building something no one can take away. And one day, she'd prove it, brick by brick, invoice by invoice, until her name was the only one on the deed. It was funny, the way the big break arrived looking like a headache. She was hunched in the corner of her cramped studio, the one she'd finally managed to rent with a deposit scraped together from months of no sleep and no days off, when the email pinged her phone at 3 a.m. She almost ignored it. After all, she'd learned the hard way that 3 a.m. emails rarely meant anything good. But the subject line caught her, urgent design pitch, large contract. She opened it, reading through blurry eyes. A small but growing overseas company had stumbled across one of her logo redesigns buried in an old portfolio site she'd nearly forgotten. They loved the style, loved the edge she brought to boring branding. They needed someone who could do fresh packaging and web design, and they needed her yesterday. She stared at the number they were offering, more than she'd made in 3 months of piecemeal projects. She read it 3 times to make sure she hadn't added a zero in her delirium. Then she sat back, staring at the dingy wall of her studio apartment, a slow, disbelieving grin pulling at her mouth. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt the tightness in her chest loosen. She should have felt panic, but she didn't. She felt ready. Everything she'd done, every pet logo for $20, every odd job that taught her how to juggle impossible deadlines and impossible people, it all added up to this. She stayed up until dawn sketching mock-ups, tweaking color palettes, adding tiny touches she knew would sell her voice. By the time she hit send, the sun was rising and she could barely keep her eyes open. But when she read the reply, "Let's do it. You're hired." She didn't care how tired she was. She'd finally broken through. The first wire transfer felt like an electric shock, the number blinking back at her through her banking app, proof she could do this without begging for permission or forgiveness. She set up an LLC the next week. A real business. Her business. She called it the name she'd doodled on scrap paper during those long nights on borrowed couches, the name she'd dreamed of but never dared say out loud back when her father's voice still rattled in her head, telling her she'd never stick with anything. Clients started to come by word of mouth, small at first, then bigger. She kept her overhead low, still working in that cramped studio, eating instant noodles more often than she'd admit, just to watch her savings grow. She learned to say no to the gigs that drained her, learned to spot the clients who'd try to wring her dry for exposure. She learned that she could trust herself more than any paycheck signed by a boss who didn't know her name. When her parents called, the rare, polite check-in that came around birthdays and Christmas, they never asked what she was doing for work. They assumed she'd found another low-end desk job or maybe was still drifting from gig to gig. She let them think it. It was easier than trying to explain. They bragged about her brother's new car, his promotion, the vacation he'd taken with money they'd lent him just to help him get ahead. She smiled into the phone, made the right noises, and hung up. She knew what they'd say if she tried to tell them, "It won't last. Don't get your hopes up." So she kept her hopes quiet and her bank account growing. She filed her taxes with careful precision, ticked off every milestone, first 5 figures, first 6, like a private celebration. One evening, she stood in front of the building they rented, her parents' precious little shopfront that they still paid late rent on every other month while bragging to neighbors about how self-sufficient they were. She leaned against a lamppost across the street, the same way she had that first bitter winter night they turned off the porch light behind her. But this time, she didn't feel small. She felt steady. The rent she was paying now was for her own freedom, and every cent she saved brought her closer to something that would prove, once and for all, who the real failure was. She didn't want revenge. Not exactly. But she wanted a door they could never close on her again, because she'd hold the keys. And soon, she'd have exactly that. She never liked the word opportunity. To her parents, it was just another way of saying something for your brother. He'd get the loan co-signed, the used car paid off, the holiday money advanced with a wink and a promise he never kept. For her, there was always a catch. The cheap pat on the head when she got a little job interview, the tight-lipped smile when she landed a freelance gig that wouldn't cover her rent for a week. Just an opportunity, they'd say. Always a test she was bound to fail. So when the real opportunity came, it didn't look flashy. It was a quiet Tuesday night, a bit of small talk that slipped out like a secret. She was having late coffee with Mr. Patel, her old landlord from her first crumbling studio, the one who'd noticed she always paid on time, always fixed what she could herself. He was semi-retired now, but still liked to check in on her, half landlord, half reluctant mentor. They sat outside a corner cafe, the air warm enough that the city didn't feel so cruel. He sipped his bitter tea, peering at her over his glasses. "You're still working with those overseas contracts, huh?" he asked, more curious than nosy. She nodded, telling him about her latest client, a brand redesign that had just landed her a chunk of money big enough to make her fingers tremble when she checked her bank app. He laughed. "Good for you. You always did have more spine than sense. Your parents know?" She shrugged, looking down at her mug. She never talked about them, not really. It was easier to keep that bruise covered up. Mr. Patel leaned back, glancing down the street. "You know the old Merton building, yeah? Corner of Vine and 6th? She blinked, surprised. Of course she knew it. The squat brick storefront, the old awning that flapped in every windstorm. The upstairs apartment with the peeling paint, her parents' rented piece of pride and control, the same place they'd told everyone they'd buy someday. The place they'd never upgraded because they were convinced it was their forever fallback. Yeah, she said carefully. Asterisk, what about it? Mr. Patel snorted. Asterisk, well, rumor is, old man Harrow's finally fed up with being a landlord. Tenants always late, buildings falling apart, taxes keep creeping up. He wants to sell before he keels over. She felt something shift in her chest, like a hinge creaking open that she didn't know was stuck. Did he put it up yet? Asterisk, no sign yet, but you know Harrow. He's discreet. Wants it off his hands without a fuss, wants a buyer who'll handle the headaches without squealing about the roof leaking or the old wiring. She drummed her fingers on the table, the same old habit she had when she was 14 and drawing up business plans on the back of her homework. She could almost see the puzzle pieces snapping together, the savings account she'd guarded like a dragon, the small line of credit she'd built by being annoyingly responsible, the contacts she'd made through the same hustle her parents once mocked. You thinking what I'm thinking? Mr. Patel asked, eyes twinkling. She shrugged, a slow smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. Asterisk, I'm just thinking maybe my rent money's better spent buying a headache that pays me back. He cackled so loud the barista glanced outside. Asterisk, knew you'd figure it out one day. Just be smart, Harrow's old school. Show him you've got the cash, he won't care who you are. She walked home under the streetlights, the city alive with the quiet hum that always made her feel bigger than the smallness her parents tried to wrap her in. Every step felt like counting coins, every echo a reminder, they'd kicked her out because she was just a dreamer. And now their dreams sat on a lot she could hold in her palm, if she dared. That night, she spread every account statement out on her floor, highlighters and pens scattered around her like confetti. She didn't sleep. She didn't need to. She knew, in the marrow of her bones, that she was ready. Next time she saw that building, she'd be standing on the sidewalk with the deed in her name. And the failure they'd turned away would be the landlord they'd never see coming. She didn't tell anyone. Not her old friends who'd lent her couches when she had nowhere to go. Not her mentor who'd planted the seed. Not even the few clients she'd come to trust as real friends. Some victories needed to be grown in silence, protected from the poison of too many opinions. She spent 2 weeks gathering every last shred of what she'd built. She went line by line through her bank accounts, moved money around like puzzle pieces, pulled out every invoice that was owed to her and gently nudged late clients to pay up. She sat on hold with her credit union for hours, made polite small talk with the loan officer, played the part of the calm, sensible small business owner. And it was true, she was all those things now. No one needed to know she still lay awake some nights wondering if she'd mess it all up. The morning she met Mr. Harrow, she woke before dawn. She dressed like she used to for job interviews she'd never get, black pants pressed crisp, hair tied back, not a single pen mark on her hands. She'd grown so used to doing everything behind a screen that the idea of sitting across from the man who held her family's future in his gnarled hands made her stomach twist. But Mr. Harrow wasn't what she expected. He was half deaf and twice as sharp, with eyes like ice chips that missed nothing. He asked for numbers first, no small talk, no polite questions about where she came from. She slid the neat folder across the cafe table they'd agreed on, neutral ground, no offices where old secrets might linger. He flipped through her statements, her references, the proof of funds she'd lined up. Every page was clean. Every figure real. Why this building? He asked at one point, peering at her over the rim of his old reading glasses. Asterisk, it's a dump. You could get something prettier for this price. She smiled the smallest smile, the one she'd practiced so many nights when she wanted to scream. Asterisk, I like things that look like lost causes. They tend to surprise people. He laughed at that, a raspy bark that startled the waitress behind the counter. Ha! Better you than me, girl. He shuffled the papers back into the folder. Asterisk, you keep your tenants on time? She tapped the folder. Asterisk, they'll pay. Or they'll leave. Either way, the math works. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of silence that used to make her squirm when her father let it hang between them like an accusation. But she didn't squirm now. She held his gaze, still and patient, like the orchard she dreamed of planting one day, roots deep, storms be damned. Finally, he stuck out his hand. Asterisk, it's yours then. Wire the deposit. I'll have my lawyer send the draft tomorrow. When she stepped back out into the bright street, she felt her knees almost give. Not from fear, from relief. It was done. Not yet official, but as real as the ground under her feet. She leaned against the bricks of the cafe, phone pressed to her ear as she called her lawyer to confirm the next steps. Her hand shook just once when she hung up, then she took a slow breath and let the city noise wash over her. A week later, she sat in a clean office downtown, the kind with big windows and a view that made you feel smaller than you were. She signed her name so many times her wrist cramped, a name her father once said would never be attached to anything that mattered. And when it was done, she walked out with a manila envelope in her tote bag, title, keys, and a stack of official paperwork that proved the building was now hers. That evening, she didn't march up to her parents' door to gloat. She just walked by the building once, the flickering sign above the shop front, the windows upstairs glowing warm where her parents sat eating dinner, never once imagining who now owned the walls around them. She traced her finger along the brick as she passed, like a promise to her younger self. The one they'd kicked out with nothing but a cheap laptop in her name. The failure they'd written off now owned the roof over their heads. And she wouldn't need to say a word, the walls would say it for her. The envelope didn't look like much, just a plain white packet slid under their door one ordinary Tuesday morning. She made sure it arrived exactly like that, no special courier, no big meeting. Quiet. Undeniable. The new lease, the new rent schedule, the new rules, all tucked neatly inside with a signature at the bottom they'd recognize, even if they never wanted to admit it. She sat in her little studio that morning, watching her email for the inevitable explosion. She didn't get one, not right away. Hours ticked by. She made coffee, updated her invoicing system, checked her accounts. She walked to the park at lunch, letting the spring breeze cool the tight knot in her chest. She'd done what she'd set out to do, the building was hers, the papers filed, the notices served. It wasn't revenge. It was just the truth, signed in black ink. By sunset, her phone started to buzz. First, a text from her mother. What is this? Is this some kind of joke? She didn't answer. Then a missed call from her father. Another. Another. No voicemail. Of course not, he'd never known how to put his anger into words without making it her fault. It was almost peaceful, hearing nothing but the wind rattling the windowpanes while her phone vibrated against the table like a trapped bee. She left it there, untouched. When the knock came, she knew who it was before she looked through the peephole. Her father stood in the dim hallway, shoulders squared like he was bracing for a fight he hadn't prepared for. He didn't look small, not yet. But she could see the cracks around his eyes, the hair thinner than she remembered. He held the lease in his hand like it was a piece of rotten meat. She opened the door just enough to stand in the gap, not inviting him in. He didn't deserve that. Not anymore. What the hell is this? He spat, waving the papers. His voice was raw, half outrage, half something else, fear maybe, or the beginnings of shame. She tilted her head, calm. It's a lease. Market rate. Due the first of the month, every month. No more late fees rolling over for years. No more special arrangements. You think you can do this to us, he hissed. He didn't even seem to hear himself, how the words sounded when turned around. The irony was too rich. She folded her arms. Asterisk, it's business, Dad. That's what you always said, right? Real life. No handouts. Earn your keep. His mouth opened and closed, his eyes darting past her into the tidy apartment, the proof that she'd built her life without him. She wondered if he'd pictured this moment differently, maybe seeing her crawling back for a loan, for permission to breathe. He'd always expected the world to revolve around his disappointment. But this, standing on her threshold, hat in hand, the rent owed to the daughter he'd called worthless, this was something else. We raised you, he said finally, grasping for a foothold. Asterisk you owe us. She shook her head once, slow and steady. Asterisk no. You don't get to say that. You made your choice the night you turned off the porch light. This is my choice. She stepped back, letting the moment stretch between them like an unspoken verdict. She wasn't angry anymore. That's what stung him the most, the calm. The fact that she didn't need to scream to be right. If you can't afford the new lease, she added, voice even, asterisk I'll help you find new tenants. But you'll move. Simple as that. He stared at her, eyes glassy but dry. She knew him well enough to see it, the pride wrestling with reality, the dawning understanding that he'd never hold the strings again. When he turned to go, the lease crushed in his fist, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt free. Later that night, she walked past the building, the same stoop where she'd once begged him to give her time, to believe she was trying. Now the lights behind those windows were hers to keep or to give. She placed her palm against the brick, feeling the pulse of everything she'd built. They'd called her a failure. They'd kicked her out. And now they'd never stand on ground she didn't own again.